Hello, everyone. Glad to see you all here. We may have a few more people joining us. We have about 15 people registered for the event, so we may have a few more people joining us. So on behalf of the Marxist Education Project, I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the MEP, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to Bob Ostertag's conversation on Facebooking the Anthropocene. I'm just going to introduce Bob by quickly reading the about the author blurb from the book, which we'll spend the rest of the evening getting better acquainted with Bob. But this is a good introduction to I think to him. Says his work cannot be easily summarized or pigeonholed. He has published more than 20 albums of music, 5 books, and a feature film. His writings on contemporary politics have been published on every continent and in many languages, beginning with his work as a journalist covering the Civil War in El Salvador in the 1980s. His books cover a wide range of topics from labor unions to the history of journalism to estrogen and testosterone. He has performed at music, film, and multimedia festivals around the globe. His radically diverse musical collaborators include the Kronos Quartet, John Zorn, Mike Patton, transgender cabaret icon Justin Vivian Bond, British guitar innovator Fred Frith, EDM DJ Arose, and many others. Bob, we're very glad to have you here tonight. We've invited you to say as much as you'd like about your book and your work, and just start the conversation, and then we'll encourage everyone else to join us with questions and comments. I hope some of you at least have read the book. I managed to skim it in the last few days. It's a tour de force, I would say, but Bob will tell us more about it now. So go ahead, Bob.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to ask, Ted, I see a Ted there. Ted, are you the Ted I know from many years ago? I can't hear you.
I am.
Oh my!
More than many years ago. What? 40 years ago?
From 40 years ago. Amazing. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you too. I'm happy to see you again all these years.
Who knew that we would still be alive and kicking?
And working
and all of that. Are you still in New York?
Yep, still in New York.
Wonderful, wonderful. Wow, so nice to see you.
You too.
Yeah, and those of you who don't have your cameras on, it's fine if you leave them off, but it's easier. I always find the Zoom things are more interesting. It feels more like a conversation if I can see who I'm talking with. So yes, Ted and I know each other from way back in El Salvador Solidarity days of the 1980s. And when I was living in New York City and then going back and forth between New York City and El Salvador. And so this book, in a way, it's about everything. We could say it's about migration and garbage and dancing and music and artificial intelligence and sex and pornography and you name it. But really, it's the way I think of it. It's about how human culture is being changed by technology, and it's something that I've thought about and written about in from various ways and angles. And I think at root, the thing that I always find myself trying to point out and highlight and encourage people to think about, there's so much said about the accelerating rate of technological change. And I think our ability to adapt to new technologies and to change our cultural selves as the result of our contact with new technologies is even faster. And that's the point that I think is so critical. And it came up recently. If you all follow the news, you probably know that a few months ago, an AI specialist at Google resigned and claimed that Google's latest chatbot was sentient. And there was a whole debate about whether Google's latest chatbot is sentient or not. And the reason they debate about whether AI is sentient or not is because for years they debated whether AI would become conscious or not. And then they couldn't come up with an actual definition of consciousness, so they switched to talking about sentience, but they can't come up with an actual definition of sentient either. It's just kicking the can further down the road. And I think it's a pointless question, but what's interesting to me is, when will AI become more compelling for people to talk to than talking to other human beings? And that does not require sentience, and it doesn't require us even delving into a philosophical discussion of what consciousness or sentience would actually be. And I could make an argument that if you look at the way we use our phones and we use this technology has already become more compelling for people to engage with than other people. In the section on pornography in my book, I make the point that, I don't have any data to back it up, but I'd be willing to bet the farm on the assertion that if you were to add up all the male orgasms that happen per day in the world, you would have to conclude that sex between humans and machines has become more common than sex between people. And to people who say, well, is that really sex between a human and a machine? I say, well, what's in the room? There's a human and a machine. And the human is touching the machine with one hand and touching him or herself with the other hand. So, if a Martian were to land and say, what's going on there? It would certainly look like sex between a person and a machine. In the last chapter in the book, I address this in terms of music and, ask the question, what is live music? And I've taken to, when I tour, I often hanging out backstage with musicians before, at music festivals and so forth. And this is, become my backstage. What do you think? I use words in, at least what my understanding is sort of a Wittgensteinian way. I don't think they have, precise meanings. I think their meanings emerge from how they're used. So I always ask people, what the last time you said, wow, I love live music, or I miss live music because of COVID, or, whatever. What did you mean? Like when you said that, what did you mean? What's the threshold between live music and not live music? If I walk on stage and press play, is that live music? Yeah. Okay, if that's not live music, how about I walk on stage, press play, and turn a knob? Okay, how about two knobs? How many knobs do I have to turn how many times before it's become live music? And again, that's a way to, I'm not trying to have an argument about what live music really is and really isn't. I'm trying to use the evolution of the language as a way to track changes in culture. So, live music is an interesting idea. It's one of those ideas that you can pretty precisely date to when it emerged on the face of the earth. And before recording, there was no live music. There was only music. And the notion that there was a thing called live music was born with recording. And live music meant music wasn't recorded. Now you go to a concert and almost every band you'll see has some sort of instrument that's at its core playing back recordings. So the snake is biting its tail, and we play recordings live. And I'm fascinated with DJ culture. Just as we could say that most sex in the world happens between humans and machines, I would say the vast majority of dancing in the world happens with rhythms produced by machines. And rhythms produced by machines are different than rhythms produced by human bodies. And I can explain precisely what I mean. Here's what the difference is. For all of music before computers, musical time is sort of an ideal grid that musicians have in their background, in the back of their mind, but you never hear it because human bodies can't play precisely divided intervals of time. That's not the way our bodies work, and that's not the way that we perceive time. So every kind of human music is off the ideal grid. And in fact, a lot of what gives different kinds of human generated music their sort of signature is the way that they vary from ideal time. And in the world of jazz, they thought about that. That was such a central fact to jazz that they developed a word for it, swing. Swing is how far off the ideal grid you actually play. So it became an explicit component of jazz, but you could say that it's a component of every kind of human generated music. Once we had computers, that ideal grid of time that nobody had ever heard before, ever, became what you actually heard. And it's very interesting. So I started playing electronic music, before we used computers to do it, back when we used tapes and analog electronics and so forth. And so I was sort of present at the transition to music that was done by computers. And it was amazing to me because I remember when the first sequencers came out, and those were the first things that actually generated ideal time. And those of us who had been making electronic music before then thought, well, that's kind of interesting, but nobody will ever listen to that. It sounds, completely boring. So, we went to work trying to figure out how to make these things sound like more human. And before the problem could be solved in an engineering way, a whole new generation had arrived who liked that it was machine time and not human time. And it was fascinating to me because it's the most generational thing I had ever seen in music. I don't know anybody who grew up dancing to and listening to human time music who finds listening to machine time music a satisfactory experience. And I don't know anybody who grew up listening to machine time music who has any problem with it whatsoever. And in fact, with the advent of EDM, electronic dance music, I think it's safe to say that more people spend more time dancing now than ever in the history of the human race. Massive amounts of people go dance for hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours, 20 hours. They take lots of drugs and they dance. And it's always to machine time. It's very rare these days to find people who dance to human time music. There's a few little, isolated pockets, salsa music, people still dance to, but really it's a tiny is such a fundamentally human activity. And we learn so many things when we're young from dancing. We learn who our peers are. We learn how to, aggregate socially. We learn what the social food chain is in our social set. We learn who our potential romantic and sexual partners are. Music for a long time was how we aggregated labor. It's why sailors would sing and all kinds of people would sing, because they needed to synchronize their muscle power in order to aggregate it to do things like, lift masts on ships and so on and so forth. And there's a term for that. It's called entrainment. And it seems to be a uniquely human thing that we can entrain, and what specifically by entrainment. Let me see if I can get the exact definition in the book here. I want to be very precise here. Entrainment, 127. So the exact definition broadly speaking, entrainment refers to how two independent rhythmic processes can interact in such a way as to eventually synchronize. The process was first noted in 1666 by the inventor of the pendulum clock, who noticed that pendulums mounted on the same board eventually synchronize. The idea has been applied to a number of fields from chemistry to geology. Biological entrainment ranges from how living organisms synchronize to the rising and setting of the sun, which is a form of synchronizing to a rhythm they have no influence over, to how fireflies flash together, which would be mutual synchronization. Humans have the nearly unique ability to mutually synchronize to an external isochronous pulse, in other words, a pulse produced outside their bodies at a regular interval of time. And we can do more than that. We can infer a regular beat from a more complex pattern of sound, which does not include the actual beat among its audible elements. Indeed, we can hardly stop ourselves. Give us a nice groove and we will start tapping our toes in sync with each other, regardless of what languages we speak or how prominent a role dancing plays in our cultures and so on. Just give us a little encouragement and we will soon be dancing. Like language, this ability is generalized across our species. No matter how low or high we score on whatever sort of intelligence test, no matter how educated or unschooled we are, nearly all of us can learn language and learn to dance. So I ask, is there a significant threshold that is crossed when humans gather collectively to engage in this collective ritual activity we call dancing, if instead of entraining to other humans, we entrain with machines? I think it's an interesting question. And I want to be clear, I'm not trying to pose this in a sort of judgmental way. I'm not trying to say, oh, the kids are getting it wrong. They're doing, no, no, no. I'm saying there's a fundamental change here. And let's just notice. Let me put my computer in do not disturb here. Let's at least notice that there's a change. And if kids these days feel like learning to synchronize, in this day and age, if kids these days have some kind of unarticulated but intuitive feeling that learning to get along with machines is going to be more important in their lives than getting along with other people, I'm not here to tell them they're wrong. But I notice the change. Finally, the first chapter in the book is a journal that I kept of a one-year concert tour I did around the world. And I was on a university sabbatical, so I didn't have to make money. So I prioritized doing concerts in, out-of-the-way places that I would not normally go play concerts if I had to rely on the income from the concert to support the tour. And what I became fascinated with was talking to people who had gone from no electricity to smartphones in one jump. And I also realized that if we don't talk to those people now, we'll never talk to them again, because everyone has smartphones. Everyone. You can go to Papua New Guinea and see, people who've never come out of the forest who wear nothing but, a gourd over their penis and a traditional mesh bag, and they've got iPhones in their bags. I could go on with some of the characters I ran into in the most out-of-the-way places. Sometimes with 2 and 3 cell phones, because they needed the coverage was slim. So in order to talk to one person, they had to have one and another, and charging them on car batteries or a bicycle, or it's fascinating to talk to these folks. And I used to think my culture here in San Francisco was, had an insufficient critical distance from the technology of smartphones. But wow, talk to people who've gone from no electricity to smartphones in one jump, and woof, they accept those things at interface value. So I'm not sure, it's interesting to be talking to a group that identifies itself as Marxist. In my younger days, I read Marx pretty thoroughly, top to bottom. Feel like I engaged with him. I haven't really deeply engaged with Marxist writing for quite a number of years. And I'm not sure how I would connect those writings to these concerns I have now. Of course, we could talk about commodity fetishism. We could talk about how capitalism creates new needs and so forth. But I don't know that I would look to Marx for some kind of fundamental and nuanced understanding of these things that are happening, before my eyes. And by the way, I did used to teach at the New York Marxist School. I taught a long time ago. I taught a class on world systems theory at the New York Marxist School. That was many, many moons ago. Um, Finally, I guess the last thing I'll say before we open it up to questions is I have this other book. I'll pull it out here. There you go. Sex, Science, Self, A Social History of Estrogen, Testosterone, and Identity. And I wrote this book about 10 years ago. And it's deals with pretty much exactly what we've been talking about, how human culture adapts to changes in technology. And I wrote that, I'm gay and I'm very out and about in the LGBT world and so on and so forth. And about 10 years ago, I noticed that so many people in my own social circles were taking estrogen and testosterone. And I would ask them, I'd say, so, who owns that? Like who makes money when you buy that? And was that discovered or invented? And what does it actually do in your body? And this idea that you can take a chemical and change your gender, where that can't have fallen from the sky wholly formed. That must have a history that went from A to B to C, and now we've arrived at this belief. So what's that history? And nobody knew. And I thought, well, I'm a smart guy and I write history books, so this will be my contribution to the community. I'll write this history of everything that people have believed about these substances and how those beliefs have changed over time and who owns them and where power fits in the equation. And so I wrote the book, and it was roundly ignored, which I was not disappointed about, because I was pretty sure if it, got a lot of central attention, I would get all kinds of shit dumped on me, which I wasn't sure I was ready for. Because it turns out that the history of these substances are one medical catastrophe after another. It's really quite an extraordinary history of cycle after cycle of crusading doctors making extravagant claims and building up radical medical practices that then crash and burn in huge recrimination and lawsuits, and everybody's embarrassed and the medical profession gets a black eye, and then it all happens again. And so it's a history book. It's not it's a history book. It's not a political screed about the present, but it's hard to even tell the history without implicitly suggesting that perhaps our current set of beliefs about these substances will prove as transitory as our previous sets of beliefs about them. You can't tell the history without it somehow occurring to you that maybe the current set of beliefs are going to crash and burn as well. And of course, if you're somebody who has engaged with those technologies because you ascribed a particular meaning to those technologies, and you've engaged with them so deeply that your own sense of self is tied up with the meaning that you ascribe to that technology, then you can interpret any kind of questioning of that technology as an assault on your personhood, which is understandable. But we can't simply declare whole areas of history as untellable and unsayable because they make us uncomfortable. I will plant my flag on the land that says all history is tellable and that all technology is questionable. And in fact, questioning the meaning of technology at this time when, we've got forest fires in California and, questioning technology is more urgent than ever. Well, so what's happened is book's been out a few years. Well, now, because of the highly politicized debate over hormones for minors that's erupted, and now there's, bestsellers addressing the question of whether or not you should give, hormones to minors who've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Suddenly, my book has been rediscovered. And so I'm on all these podcasts and this and that, and there's going to be an op-ed in the Dallas paper on Sunday. And it's so fascinating because when I wrote the book, this was not a politicized left-right issue. And now it's completely a politicized left-right issue. There are 22 states where the Republicans have introduced laws to ban giving hormones to minors to transition their genders. 22 states. And the Biden administration and the Democratic Party are all in on fighting those laws. So this has become, one of, along with abortion, it's the thing. And I land on the side of questioning that. So I have to spend all this time now saying, I wrote a book that questions whether, which suggests that we be wary of seeking personal liberation through, products manufactured by transnational corporations and sold at a profit. By any definition I know, that is not a right-wing argument. It's a left-wing argument. And I seem to be quite out alone in the woods on this. But, I've been alone in the woods before, and it's okay. It's just curious. So for me, this book about how humans engage with hormones, and this book, which is about how humans engage with their phones and their DJ stations and their online pornography and stuff. To me, it's all all of one piece, and I've been addressing these same concerns for a long time, just through different lenses. Okay, that's probably enough of me talking without you all talking. So, Fred, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, Bob, thanks a lot. There's so much there to discuss and digest and think about. I just ask if anyone wants to join the conversation, just write the word STACK, S-T-A-C-K, in the chat. We'll then add you to the speaker stack. Or alternatively, you can use the Zoom function of raising your hand with the reactions button in the bottom of your screen. I would like to just kind of get the conversation started by saying, as you were talking and then before you said you didn't quite see how this could relate to Marxism. And by the way, we're not necessarily all Marxists here this evening. The Marxist Education Project is sponsoring this. We've invited everyone who's interested in your book, these topics to join us, and people can speak for themselves whether they work in or think in a Marxist framework. Personally, I do. And I was thinking about the chapter on machinery in Marxist Capital, Volume 1.
Fred, one point. I'm very delighted to be doing this because some of the podcasts I've been on are going to be framed as being from the right. And so I'm delighted I'm going to be able to say, yeah, but I also talked to the Marxist Education Project.
Yeah, of course, we are the legacy of the New York Marxist School.
Yeah.
Where our roots are, for sure.
It's extraordinary, this idea these days that we shouldn't talk to people who disagree with us. I think it reflects that we don't believe we can win anybody over in our arguments anymore. You know, we talk to people who already think like this, like we do too, so that we can give them more ammunition for the things we already believe, but we don't engage with, you know, because we just don't believe that somebody who doesn't think like us is going to change their mind, which might be pretty close to true in this highly polarized world. Fred, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. Speaking of that, I mean, I'm just wondering to what extent the polarization and the inability to speak to people we disagree with is a consequence, in part, of our feeling more comfortable interacting with machines than we do with real human beings, and the fear of confronting someone, you know, directly, personally, in person, with whom we might, you know, disagree, or, you know, the discomfort involved in doing that is, you know, no doubt a factor. But to get back to what I was just going to riff on a little bit, the you know, Marx's chapter on machines and machinery in Capital, and the so-called fragment on machines from the Grundrisse, is all about the transition from the use of, one thing it's about is the transition from the use of tools, where people actually, you know, manipulated natural objects and to form them into useful products for human consumption and use. And the way in which the introduction of machinery, in the strict sense, in factory production and so on, de-skills people, removes them from any direct interaction with the tool. The tool is the tool is at the end of the machine, and the individual worker is tending the machine, or assuring that the machine does its job properly, rather than actually any longer carving or stamping or drilling, or, well, drilling is a little ambiguous, but you know, actually interacting directly with the natural objects and performing labor and producing you know, use values and so on. So that's one area where you know, a Marxist understanding might be irrelevant to especially your discussion of. I was thinking of it in relation to dance and live, and also to live music. And you know, what live music to me is some individual actually touching, playing, manipulating an object that produces sound, and that being done directly, striking strings or hitting a drum or whatever, not certainly pushing buttons or necessarily even, you know, turning a turntable. And then finally, just another way in which to approach this from perhaps a Marxist standpoint would be to ask, and you did this a little bit in discussing the testosterone estrogen problem, but how are these phenomena, these things, monetized? And you know, the technologists, you know, come to us with technologies, but that introduction of technology is always, under capitalism, mediated by someone selling those technologies in order to you know, to reap a profit. So it's not you know, it's not really a neutral process in any way. There's already a shaping of the technology by those who wish to profit from it. So those are just a couple of thoughts, but I'd like, you know, anyone else to speak up at this point. I see Alana is on the stack. Please speak up, and Bob, maybe, you know, as people join the stack, we'll take, you know, 2 or 3 comments and questions, and then come back to you periodically. So Alana, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Bob. I should say that although I actually work with the Marxist Education Project, I am not a Marxist. I'm one of those non-Marxists who are always interested in learning, and I'm glad to continue being part of this project where I meet interesting people and hear interesting talks. So I'm not sure if this is at all relevant. I haven't read your book, um, and I might have missed a little bit of your talk. But I was interested in, partly because of the work that I do in my working life, if the thing about when you said about personal liberation and also talking about the sort of corporatization of pharmaceuticals and the pharmaceutical industry. If you find that, like, you have any thoughts on like how the prohibition of cannabis in this country for many years, and now the sort of legalization in many states, first from the medical cannabis perspective, and then through adult use, recreational legalization, how that sort of relates to this thought of not being able to experience the world directly or whatever. I don't know. Just FYI, I don't actually smoke pot but anymore, but I do work for a major cannabis producer in California. Anyway, I don't know if this has any kind of, but I couldn't help, partly because of the work I do, but also because of the conversation about drugs and the drug experience and personal liberation, and how the prohibition of cannabis really suppressed that. And this is not, I'm not talking about the racial component of that as well, but just in terms of personal liberation.
Could I speak directly to that?
Sure, go ahead.
I'll lose my train of thought, and that just raised all kinds of interesting issues. As I followed the debate about legalization of weed in California, here's what I noticed, that initially, when the idea that using marijuana was a medical issue and that we could legalize it through, a medical exception, I knew the people who were pushing that. They were friends of mine, actually. And I don't think they really believed. I think they were using that as a wedge, as the wedge that was going to finally get pot legalized. And when I was a kid, I smoked mountains of weed, and never thought of myself as medicating or being sick or anything like that. But now I think we have a new generation that's come up in the whole paradigm of medical marijuana, who actually believe that they are medicating themselves with marijuana. They don't see it as, a recreational drug. They see it as a medicinal drug. And I see that so much in the queer community. The transition from the sort of, if you look at the history of gay politics or queer politics, the 50s and 60s are considered the era of the homophile organizations. And then in the late 60s along comes gay liberation. And the crucial difference was, the homophile organizations of the 50s and 60s. If you look through their newsletters and their meetings, they were very much engaged with doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists, the ones they considered the least objectionable, to try to, sort out what homosexuality really was. And gay liberation said no to all that. Gay liberation, that you were liberating yourself from that more than anything else. For a lot of people, coming out in gay liberation meant that you called your doctor and said you weren't going back. I'm not going to do this therapy anymore. I no longer think this is a sickness that I have to cure or understand. I'm just going to go live my life as a normal gay person. And now, the day you come out is the day you call the doctor. and say you need a prescription. It's a 180-degree flipped. And it's amazing to me that it flipped and nobody noticed. And again, I always try and play the role of the historian. Look, I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, but if you have a political movement that like flips 180 degrees on what it's demanding, and it used to demand, we're not sick, leave us alone. The only thing we need from doctors is, a bus ticket to San Francisco and a bowl of soup when we get here. To we're sick and we need those drugs, and if you deny us those drugs, you're denying our fundamental human rights. That switch can happen with nobody noticing, and somehow thinking that this is a continuation of the same movement, is quite fascinating to me. But of course, this is not something that's just happening in the LGBT community. It's we're all swimming in the same sea. The time of gay liberation was the time that Black people stopped straightening their hair and grew froze, and women stopped wearing makeup. And the second wave feminism was initially, those initial groups came together over rap groups of women talking about how their bodies were being medicalized by getting estrogen prescriptions that they weren't so sure that they need. And so now we're all on antidepressants, and all the kids are diagnosed with one thing or another. So this is a sea change, but it is certainly, medical technology is, if you want to look at the interface of of human culture and technology, then certainly the medical field would be the point of the spear, I would say. Yeah, the point of the spear. Yeah.
Yeah, Bob, I would agree with you that and I think that most people who are serious scientists and researchers and writers in the cannabis field would say there's really no difference between medical and recreational cannabis. It's all the same, Anyway, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I on now?
Yeah.
Looks like it.
Did you call me Fred?
Sure, go ahead.
Bob, I found it very interesting, your talk, but I'm still a Marxist, and I still think of things in maybe different terms. The question becomes, what is the relationship between technology and the capitalist process, and who controls it and for what reasons? I'm more of a Luddite, and I'm more of thinking that perhaps the technological changes that are going on are actually very anti-intellectual in some ways. The difference between information, knowledge, and critique has really been destroyed, in my opinion. So what I'd like for you to little speak about is how you can relate. Technology is not autonomous, and how do you relate it to what's going on in the structure of economics or capitalism, and how is technology then used as a tool for exploitation also?
Well, now those are big questions. Wow. Thinking on my feet here about questions that big. I think a lot of the technologies we're talking about are doing extraordinary social harm. Extraordinary social harm. I don't see a way to stop that train. I think that train has left the station, and I don't see a way to stop it. When I was younger and was immersed in Marx, I was pretty confident in my belief that a Marxist framework of analysis could explain the way the dynamic of exploitation was playing out in the world. And it's not like I think that analysis now is wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I'm not sure it's adequate. When we get to a point where, well, certainly one thing that's happening in the world is that there's more and more. The surplus army of labor is growing by the regiment and brigade and company. I mean, there are a lot of workers, that we don't need. How many workers produce Tesla cars? I mean, I live in San Francisco. All these Silicon Valley folks, are they really workers? I don't know.
I think Marx's vision of technology is quite different, and people haven't really explained it quite clearly. In fact, it allows us, and we all know that Marx was over in the manifesto. He talks about the bourgeoisie, and he talks about how much the progress they've made in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So the point being that if technology is used for good, of course, it could solve human needs. And Marx's vision, of course, is that people's necessities will be taken care of, and therefore we could live a free, independent, democratic life. So but that would be only if technology becomes out of the hands of the ruling class and capitalist class and becomes socialized, of course. And the vision of Marx and technology is, I think, beautiful. It means that we could solve all the needs of human beings if it was socialized. And it means also that we could live a free life because we'd have the necessities of life, and also we'd have a utopian vision of what we could do without being bogged down by wage labor and alienation.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that.
And how are we going to get?
Nice to see you, and nice to hear you articulating those thoughts. What's that?
As activists, how are we going to get there?
I don't think we're going to get there.
Okay.
I don't. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to dominate. I just want to ask, if we're not going to get there, then you're prepared to accept the destruction of the planet and the world, of course, with climate change.
Why don't we give Richard Myers a chance?
I'm sorry if
see where Richard would like to take us. But we can always return to Ted's question. It's an important one.
Thank you.
Thoughts have gone through my mind based on some of the things that you said, including Bob, you said about having taught a class a long time ago about systems and so on, and talking about, in my studies of technology, I've found like two words to be helpful to understanding. That is technology on the one hand and technological on the other. Technology being the hardware, technological, the technology in relationship to culture, politics, economics, and so on. So therefore we have automobiles, and we also have an automobile culture. Now, as technology has gotten more complex, we ordinary people have been pushed out of the process of full participation. That is, we can't build our own cars, make our own cell phones, and so on. We're reduced to using technology that is introduced, usually by the creators of that technology and the advertisers of it, who stand in this kind of system to make a profit in the capitalist system. So we come into this as more passive recipients. And that seems to me to be something worth thinking about. That certainly would fit into, a more Marxist perspective, which I find very helpful in understanding this too. But that difference between technology and technological, and I'm wondering if you've, thought about it along those lines, because I often find people confusing that and saying technology when they're really talking about technological, about their participation in it, and vice versa, and so on. So I'm wondering if you thought about that at all, given that you've looked at systems and so on in the past.
Um, well, I I don't articulate it that way as the difference between technology and technological. But in a way, you could say that's at the core of everything I've been writing. Um, the role that I've been taking in my writing is not as I'm not proposing any solutions. Wish I was. Wish I was. Um, I can't honestly do so. I do not honestly believe that I have any solutions. And when it comes to climate change, which I follow very carefully, you know, it's pretty late in the day right now. It's pretty late in the day right now. So whether or not I'm willing to accept that um, might be pretty beside the point. And I spend a lot of time contemplating the ethics of that situation and what to do. You know, what's the ethical thing to do? You know, about 14, 15 years ago, I had the idea of writing a book, and what I was going to do, I wanted to ask the same question of scientists, uh, priests and pastors and imams and rabbis, philosophers, scientists, you name it. Everybody was going to get the same question. And the question was, you know, scientists are debating whether there's a tipping point in climate change past which, you know, runaway climate change of a civilization threatening level will be unstoppable. No matter what you think about that now, assume for a minute that we're past the tipping point. What do we do? Is there anything in your philosophy or religion or whatever it is that suggests what the ethical thing to do is? And I started it, and I started out talking to fundamentalist Christians. It was funny. There actually is a subset of fundamentalist Pentecostals who, you know, think climate change is the ultimate sin. I was fascinating talking to them. But I got so depressed, I stopped writing the book. But yes, I've thought about that long and hard. And but the role that I'm playing with my books is not, you know, I'm not trying to be Marx, and I'm not trying to start a revolution, and it's a more humble role. It's trying to point out what's actually happening in front of our noses. When I started writing about, you know, what was happening to human sex and pornography, it was because when I got hired at Davis, I was in this technocultural studies department, and they were all excited about, you know, what was going to happen when virtual reality got here, and the latest thing that was being done at the MIT lab, and blah, blah, blah. And I took the position, you know, why don't we look at what's happening with the technology we have right now? How much more, you know, these things that you're saying are going to happen when we get effective virtual reality, I think they're happening right now. If you just look around. And so that's sort of been the role I've been playing. And again, that recent debate about whether the chatbots are sentient now, I think is so silly. But are they going to be better therapists than human therapists? Now, there's a issue. There's a question that's very real. Your chatbot therapist will never forget anything you've told it. It'll be available 24/7. It won't cost nearly as much as your therapist charges. And it will look for repetitive cycles in your behavior that you might want to change. And I think that's coming. That's coming. And it won't be because people are fooled into believing that the chatbot is a person. It'll be because a chatbot turns out to be a more compelling therapist than a person would be. I mean, that's here. And, you know, when people constantly engage in pornography, it's not, one of the points I make about pornography is, you know, used to be that pornography was the sort of second best substitute thing you did when sex with another person wasn't available. Now, pornography is the metric by which we engage, evaluate our sexual experiences with other people. It's become the ideal. And yeah, this is the process that I want to, you know, so yeah. Ted, I wish I you know, had something more radical to say about climate change. Goodness.
Can I just jump in here to a quick follow-up? It seems to me that our whole relationship with technology and its various possible outcomes is a deeply ethical process. Now, the way I've resolved that for myself comes from, you know, somewhat of a, you're talking about different religious leaders you contacted, a Buddhist perspective more. And that is that one acts in the world not with an assurance that what you do is going to change things finally or even make a huge difference, but that you do it because it's the right thing to do. You know, and that implies that you have certain values or standards that you are incorporating into that system. So for me, it's how do I maintain this direct relationship with other life on this planet, both human and non-human?
Mm-hmm.
And do I have the responsibility at times to speak up for people or things that maybe can't speak up for themselves? A child who's being abused, you know, wildlife that's going extinct, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
But I do it not with the assurance that what I do has to make a difference or else I wouldn't do it, but I do it because it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And now where I find some hope in that is that my study of history has shown me that oftentimes when people are ready to give up or things seem most desperate, that somehow we manage to muddle through, or somebody or group comes through with an idea that radically changes how we're dealing with things. And the more opportunity we can give ourselves for that, I think the better. Now, I would agree with you. With climate change, this is a new ball game. And I would have to agree, you know, the future looks pretty bleak. Doesn't mean an end for humanity, but certainly the future that my grandnephews and nieces and, you know, their kids are going to live in is going to be nothing like we're used to. And even if we stopped and did everything right from today on, it's going to be a horrible world in many ways. But maybe, just maybe within that sort of doomsday context, we will find a way to make peace with nature and each other and to draw out of that the best world possible given those circumstances. We can't make, and that's where the following on Marx, we can't make things out of whole cloth ourselves. We take what we're given and we do the best we can with that. But I'm not prepared to accept at this time that, you know, the whole show is over, although, you know, I could make an argument for that too. But to me, you know, it's that ethical thing, and it seems like even if this is the last stage of humanity, well, let's go out living it in a way that maybe we could be proud of, and just maybe we'll find a way to continue on in some new kind of form that we can't even imagine yet, but that may become possible as we muddle our way through these challenges. So that's my own. I'm not advocating somebody else do that, but it's my own perspective that I've developed over time and studying history and technology and so
If I may, Richard, I love that approach, and it's something that not long ago there was a lot of discussion among climate activists about we have 10 years. There's only 10 years left. We have to do something dramatic in the next 10 years. And I would respond to that by saying, well, what about year 11? What about year 15? What about year 30? Many of us are still going to be here. I hope I'm still here in year 11 from now. And you know what? Humanity is going to continue to confront this problem for the rest of its existence, however long or short that is. So the approach has to be, you know, not panic and you know, I mean, certainly it's urgent, but to say we have 10 years it's kind of a defeatist approach, and it doesn't really move us forward. I wanted to kind of change the subject a little bit for Bob and ask if in the course of your travels and experiences, you were not only observing people interacting with machines, but if you were able to observe any major, you know, resistance movements or protest movements that arose in, I mean, the last 10 years have been just, you know, one uprising or dramatic protest after another, starting maybe with the Arab Spring, with Wisconsin, and around 2010-11, Occupy, the Black Lives Matter uprising around George Floyd, what we're seeing on the streets of Iran right now, Lebanon, Sudan, Algeria, Chile, Colombia. I could go on and on with that list, but those are people getting in the streets, marching together. You know, they're maybe acquiring some, you know, rhythmic entrainment that brings them into confrontation with their rulers and their oppressors, and is, you know, mediated to some extent by smartphones and so on. But by and large, it's a pretty direct human response to some intolerable situations. So I'm just wondering if there's cause for hope in that as well.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to travel a lot because of my music, and so I have, you know, my traveling has touched. As Ted knows, I was very involved in the Central America stuff in the 80s, and eventually left the Solidarity stuff to work in El Salvador, and spent my last few years of that in El Salvador. Trying to be a good citizen in whatever way I could. That's a whole other story that we could discuss. In the 90s, I got quite close to the Balkan conflict and the Balkan Wars. And I wrote about that in one of my books. I was in Istanbul right after the suppression of their Arab Spring moment. I've been close to Palestinian activism, and I've gone to Israel and Palestine. Just tomorrow I have a musical track coming out in Musicians for Palestine. And I presume, coming out of the Occupy stuff, I had a podcast that I did together with Maureen Taylor, a tidal wave, a hurricane of a woman who is in Detroit and is the state chair of the Michigan Welfare Rights Corporation, and works with the poorest people in Detroit. And she and I had a podcast about poverty and struggle in America. And that also came out of doing a residency in Detroit and interfacing with poverty activism in Detroit. And most recently, I've become very close to and I actually give funding to a Waria collective in Yogyakarta in Java, Indonesia. Waria are sort of traditional Javanese gender. In our culture today, the closest thing we would have would be a trans woman. But Waria have existed long before the term trans woman appeared. And I work together with them and help fund their shelter. They run a shelter for Waria, for gay kids kicked out of their homes, and for anybody who's victim of sexual violence. And when it comes to climate change, actually, the one thing I've written that actually went viral was when Obama was first inaugurated, and the mainline LGBT organizations called for a boycott of his inauguration because he had invited this fundamentalist pastor to give the prayer, and that pastor was opposed to gay marriage. And so they wanted and I wrote a thing in the Huffington Post pointing out that this pastor I happened to know was the leader of that sector of evangelicalism that was on fire about climate change. And that I thought that climate change was a much more important issue than gay marriage. And yes, you can imagine the grief I caught for that. But I did point out that the gay movement could have been making cause with all those single mothers who, that instead of trying to get it so that our couples had the same privileges that straight couples had, we could be struggling for the right that people in couples should not have any rights that people not in couples have. And that would be a more democratic approach. And anyway, climate change was more important. So yes, political struggle is, something that I please don't think from my book writing that political struggle is not something I engage with. And this is another book here. This is called Creative Life, Music, Politics, People, and Machines. And this one would be a sort of a memoir that is would be much more on the front lines, on the barricades than the kind of writing I've been doing more recently. And what Fred and Richard say about a Buddha, my understanding is that a Buddhist approach is you always act as if what you're doing is going to have a big impact, and even though you never believe it will. Something like that. Or as I think there's a famous Buddha, I can't remember who said it, but a dear friend of mine had it up on his refrigerator, and it was the mantra that he lived by, and the saying was that hope was like a path in the woods. At first, there's no path there, but by people just walking the same way, a path appears, and that was what hope was. And I thought that was, but then, after a while, you get tired of spending your life in losing political struggles, and you decide, I don't want to just support a symbolic campaign, that isn't going to win or do anything. Like I actually want to win something real for that will make a real impact in real people's lives. So I don't have any answers to all of that. But yes, Marx is great. In fact, y'all are reminding me, I should go back and read Marx's section of Capital on on machines. I should definitely do that. I have not read that for a long time. I found Lewis Mumford quite interesting. He's another guy who thought carefully about technology. And he had a very interesting statement. He thought the most transformative technology in history was not the steam engine or the assembly line or anything. He thought it was the clock. Because he said there was nothing about human life that suggested that time was divided into equal increments. Days aren't the same length. The rains come, the rains go. Seasons aren't precise. There was nothing in the natural world that suggested that time was time was divided into equal increments. And so that was a novel idea introduced by the clock. And when you think about it, this laptop I'm on talking to you all is a very sophisticated clock. And it's dividing time into really tiny intervals. And so here we are with the current iteration of the clock. It's just called a MacBook Pro.
Alana is suggesting in the chat that we pay more attention to Hugo's comment in the chat. I wonder, Hugo, if you would like to vocalize that, or if we can just read it off the chat. If you would prefer not to speak, that's fine, but I'm kind of inviting you to talk about what you put in the chat, if you will.
Hello.
Hello, there you are.
Hi.
So I think it really just comes down to a question of the body. I sort of made the distinction in my chat comment about a distinction between what I call body music, music made by bodies in a certain moment of time and physical space, versus machine music, which is made by machines. And that's not the same as a recording. A recording, if it's a recording of analog, bodily made music, is a reproduction. But machine music is not a reproduction of anything that is physical or bodily. It is simply a mechanical repetition of the same set of digital code. So I was just wondering if Bob had any thoughts about the difference between living in a world that essentially is sort of bodiless versus a world that is embodied.
Yeah, good comments. So I started out my musical career, which has gone on for decades now. I think at last count I have 28 CDs or some ridiculous number like that. And I started out in the 1970s playing a modular analog synthesizer that had no keyboard and just buttons and knobs. And I'm not the first person to take normally those things were used in studios. I'm not the first person who took one on stage, but I believe I am the first person who made taking it on stage and improvising with people who played saxophone and drums and guitars and basses the center of my musical practice, which I did in Manhattan in the 1970s with John Zorn and Fred Frith and all those guys. And I was very conscious at the time that what I was doing was something different from what the people around me were doing, because they were hitting drums and blowing into saxophones, and I was tweaking knobs and unplugging and plugging patch cord cables. And I wasn't sure if what I was doing was constituted a performance. And I felt quite insecure about it. And that's one of the reasons I always tried to take people who were playing instruments on stage with me. It felt very odd to be alone on a stage turning a knob. It seemed like I was good at it in the sense that, if 100 people worked at playing one of those synthesizers, somehow my stuff came out sounding, pretty good. But I couldn't turn a knob better than anybody else could turn a knob. That wasn't the skill. I was not a virtuoso knob turner, And so it's been fascinating to me to see another generation come up that has absolutely no problem with standing alone on stage, turning a knob. And that think, that is now the most common musical performance in the world, by far. If you were add up all the time human beings spend on stage playing music for audiences, the overwhelming majority is going to be people standing alone on stage turning a knob. And now we have, Hugo, the distinction you make, I think, is the right distinction, but it breaks down. For example, what if you take a recording of people playing live music in a human time, and then you take one measure of it and loop it over and over again, and you loop it in an electronically precise way. So where does that fall? I actually did a whole project. I had a 7-year project where I sort of tried to interrogate this very thing. I had my project was I took 3 musicians who were from the free jazz world, extraordinary improvisers, world-renowned improvisers, and I told each one to go into a recording studio and improvise a solo and send me the tape. And then I put the tapes into the computer and broke them into little fragments and stitched them together into a band and released that as the group's first recording. And then I gave them the recording and said, okay, this is the score, learn your part, and we'll get together and play it as a live group. And so we did that, and that we made a live record. So that was the live ensemble playing the compositions made on the computer out of the fragments of the solos. Then I took that recording, put it back into the computer, ripped it up into little bits, made a new composition. So it was a cycle that was alternating virtual and human, and virtual and human. Some of the interesting, I got some very interesting answers from musicians. One of the best, most thoughtful answers I got was from Chris Cutler, who's a drummer in England, and he's also a philosopher and writes. And he said he thought for him the difference that music was live if the performance could fail on aesthetic rather than technical grounds, which I thought was a very thoughtful distinction. And Gio Wyeth, who's younger and part of a younger generation than I was, said, it's not live if you're looking at a screen, which I thought was also a very interesting notion, because, we do have people who take laptops now on stage and, perform live on their laptop. And of course, we've all had that experience of talking to somebody, and in the middle of the conversation, they take out their phone and they're kind of like, and you experience that they're absenting themselves from the conversation when they're looking at the screen. So I thought, well, that makes sense, So I said, well, Gio, I used to have a digital keyboard that had a tiny little LCD screen on it, that was, and I was looking at that while I was playing, did that mean that wasn't live? And Gio said, no, that was live. I said, so how big does a screen have to be before it's not live? I finally decided that my definition was, if everybody on stage can have a heart attack and die and the music doesn't stop, then it wasn't live. which, is a joke. But again, my point is, not that there's a right definition, but it's a fascinating thing that we use that term all the time. Oh, I went to see live music last night. Oh, I love live music. And actually, we don't know what it means.
So anyone else who'd like to join the conversation with Bob? If not, I have another topic to bring up, but I'll pause for a moment. Richard.
Yeah, just a quick comment, Bob. Thanks for mentioning Lewis Mumford. I think it was probably him more than any other single writer or person when I was 50 years or so ago. It got me interested in studying history of technology more. I've had one of my favorite quotes from him was something like, "Forget the damn motor car and build the cities for lovers and friends." I felt like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you're making a much different. But what it gets at really is who gets to make the choices about what kind of environment that we live in. I mean, you could take apart that quote and go into all sorts of different directions, and that seems to still be a relevant point of entry here today, in that most of us are not having any kind of direct say. Like I said before, we're sort of passive participants in the technology once it's introduced in the marketplace. But we don't get, we can decide not to use a cell phone or to give up a car, walk or bike or use transportation or whatever. But the thing is, the societies are built for those technologies that have been introduced. Now to me, it's a hopeful sign. Whether it's enough or not, I don't know. But in some place in the U.S., but I've seen, especially like this past summer in Europe, where they've closed the streets, they've shut down a highway, gotten rid of a highway, and opened it up for pedestrian use and biking or outdoor dining and things like that, and sort of taking back that space for human use in a way that doesn't have to be mediated so strongly by technology. So, with that, looking at those kinds of things gives me, a little smidgen of hope that, we can make a better world to some degree and maybe get people thinking about it to move beyond that.
Well, I can tell you from my travels, I've been in most of the major cities in the world, and wow, the way you make a neighborhood nicer is make the cars go away. It's not rocket science. As soon as there's pedestrian public space without cars, everything is better. It's so obvious. Yeah. I think getting people to put down their phones is going to be harder than getting them to stop using their cars. I do think that networked cell phones is human history is going to be before and after that. I do think it is a profound change in how we experience life, even. Yeah, I do. And in my books, a lot of times I just tried to portray characters who I found were interesting. This 16-year-old homeless kid in Java who was making his living buying and selling phones. He was very savvy, and he would buy a phone that he thought was going to retain its value and then sell it a little bit later. And he was in Indonesia, you can actually buy minutes in bulk and then sell them to your friends. And I mean, he was living in a box, and his dinner was an icy at 7-Eleven. It's not like he was, living high on the hog, but he was making his living from the phone. And he told me that his ambition in life was to become as smart as his phone. And I said, "Oh, are you really sure your phone is all that smart?" And he said, "Come on, Bob, if I was as smart as my phone, I could speak every language." And he wasn't wrong, and it was shocking to me, whether or not computers will ever speak natural language as opposed to, invented language. is, one of the key debates about whether machines will be intelligent. I thought, wow, here's this 16-year-old kid in Java living in a box, and he's put his finger on exactly the debate that my friends who work in tech in Silicon Valley and get paid ridiculous, absurd salaries, he's spot on it. Spot on it. I met another young guy in Java who was, his family was nearly destitute, and basically all they owned was a motorbike, a Chinese knockoff tablet computer, and a little kerosene stove. And what he'd figured out was his mom would stay up cooking on this one burner little camping stove all night while everybody else would sleep. And then he would wake up in the morning, take pictures of all the food she had cooked on the phone, and post the pictures of the food on Instagram. And then people would buy the food off Instagram. And his mom would go to sleep. He'd spend the day delivering the food on his motorbike. And then he'd come back at the end of the day with the money and wake up his mom, go to the night market. They'd have just enough food to buy the ingredients to do it all over again. He came to visit me in San Francisco, and one day I didn't have anything planned for him. And I said, we can do anything you want today. What do you want to do? And he wanted to go to Silicon Valley to make a video selfie of himself standing in front of the Facebook corporate sign saying, "Thank you, Facebook, for allowing me to feed my family." So I just find these characters so interesting. And the last one was one I didn't talk to, but I end the chapter with him. I was in this ancient Buddhist monument, Borobudur, and there were Buddhist monks there in saffron robes with their shaved heads, taking selfies of themselves meditating in this monument. And I thought, now Buddhism, I thought, here's a Zen koan for the 21st century. If Buddhism is correct, that the self is an illusion, when a Buddhist monk takes a selfie, what's in the picture?
Anyone else? Bob, I can't resist asking you at least to say a little bit about the current president of El Salvador and his obsession with turning the country into a paradise for cryptocurrency, and the fact that he is actually, as I understand it, pretty popular among Salvadorans, despite his rather wacky predilections on that topic.
Yeah.
What's going on there? The difference between El Salvador in the 2022 and El Salvador in the 1980s is just mind-boggling.
Yeah. And Nicaragua and all
Yes.
of it.
Well,
Yeah.
although that's a little more understandable from a certain standpoint.
Yeah. It's so sad. I don't follow El Salvador, 24/7 like I used to, but I have Salvadoran friends that I stay in touch with, and I'm actually in touch with one of the founders of one of the FMLN or constituent organizations. And yeah, people have very different takes on the current president of El Salvador. People who defend him will say that right away, after he did his cryptocurrency thing, no, not everybody in the country had the app that could do it, but 60% of them did, and only 20% of people in the country have a bank account.
Mm.
So that was actually much more accessible than the banking system was. What's so tragic is the gang violence there. And unless you've been there recently, it's hard to even imagine, what the level of gang violence. It really is failed state. You're in failed state territory. A while ago, I knew the U.S. ambassador from El Salvador. I think, Teddy, you might have known him back in the day, Francisco Altschul, who was the FMLN's rep at the United Nations way back in the day. And he's a middle-class guy, and he's the ambassador to the U.S. from El Salvador. And like a lot of middle-class Salvadorans, he has a little finca out in the country. And, he couldn't go to it. It was occupied by gangs, and it had been occupied by gangs, for a long time.
Yeah.
And like the ambassador, the United States can't go to his own home. Back in the days of the FMLN and the revolution, they would have these what they called paros. It was they would declare a day of public transportation stoppage, and the goal was to try to force the armed forces to disperse their people around the country, protecting all the highways, rather than concentrate them to attack one place where the FMLN was strong. Now they have paro. The gangs are doing exactly the same thing. And, the last paro, the gangs announced that the bus companies weren't paying enough tribute to the gangs, and therefore no buses could run this particular weekend. And the buses that broke the ban and ran the bus, the drivers got burned alive. And and then just a month ago, when I can't remember what happened, some gang guy got arrested or something, and the gangs just started executing random people until the government did what they wanted to. And one of the things, back in the day in El Salvador, one of the things, after I had worked there as a journalist for some time, one of the things I thought I had learned that I thought the FMLN didn't get quite right was the FMLN, and I think to a certain extent all armed revolutionary organizations, they argued that they weren't introducing violence to the country because the level of poverty everybody's life was violent. It was a level of poverty that constituted violence in and of itself. And it was impossible to make a life in that kind of violence.
Yeah.
What I learned was,
sorry.
What I learned was that people can make lives in really destitute poverty. It's shocking to see, but they can. They can have kids. They can spend time with their kids. They can find some kind of happiness. But it's really hard to make a life in the middle of a war. A war can really get to the point where you can't make a life in that situation. And I think one of the problems the FMLN had was that the war ground on for so many years that the war itself did become a bigger problem in people's lives than the unbelievable poverty in the country. And I do think the gang violence in El Salvador now is of that level. You know, people are having a very hard time making a life. And yes, that president of El Salvador is, you know, he's declared war on the gangs. He's rounded up thousands of people. He's very frank in stating that the level of state violence that he thinks is going to be required to defeat the gangs is a level of state violence that means a lot of innocent people are going to get caught up in it, and a bunch of wrong people are going to get put in jail, and that's the price to pay, because somehow or another the gangs have to be tamed. And he's very popular. In polling, he's the most popular elected leader in the world. And it's sad. It's really sad. And I'm not near close enough to have my own opinion on what.
Well, I've know people who've come back. I've been there, and I could give some. I think it's a historical understanding of the failures. Also, the violence, yes. Also, the failures of the left to resolve some solutions, to have some solutions to the problems of the country. And I just spoke to a friend of mine who was high by the FLN. I said, if you knew what was going to happen, would you have done what you did? He said, no, of course not. But that's another question. The question then becomes, why is somebody like Bukele or Trump is popular? And we know the answers, some of the answers to that, and that has to do with right-wing populism, promising people things that, of course, he can't deliver on. And as far as the violence go, we know that putting 10,000 people in jail or murdering and killing is not going to solve any of the problems. That's a fundamental problem of poverty, as you mentioned, and it's kind of complex. But I think that, again, the way to understand it is to understand the failures of a left that wasn't able to solve the problems, and two, keep a mass base in the countryside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's nothing to be supportive of Bukele in any way. He's a brutal dictator, and he has no solutions to the problem. Yeah, it's a tragedy, of course, Bob, and you know how we worked and the vision that we had, and it's an incredible tragedy, as Nicaragua is, but they could only be understood historically, actually, in my opinion.
The people I'm in touch with from the revolutionary days are pretty divided on the current president. Deeply, deeply divided on the current president. And they're all people who I deeply respect their ethics. And like I said, I'm not near close enough to it. I don't know what. Once you get into real failed state territory, it's a heavy lift climbing out of that, and I don't have any great proposals. I don't. And what's happening in Nicaragua? Oh my goodness! Yeah. Dora Maria Tilla is in jail. I mean, come on. Well, on that happy note.
Bob, I was just going to say, we are approaching the perhaps of this conversation. It's been so wonderful and varied, and the description of you as a polymath is quite well taken, I think. But can you, or anyone else for that matter, take us out with something a little more uplifting, maybe, than Central America, which is disaster area? I mean, we haven't even mentioned Guatemala, and Honduras is perhaps the most hopeful situation, with a more of a leftist president trying to make some progressive changes, but facing her own challenges as well.
On technology, I do sell tickets on StubHub in New York City for the New York Jets. and I was having problems. And I spent an hour 2 days ago with the customer service team in Managua, Nicaragua. And so thank you. That would be deep.
Well, there
That
you
would be
go.
the question of the future, I guess.
Some folks down there are getting jobs staring at machines, at least.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Well, I appreciated talking to you. Teddy, it's lovely to see you after all this time.
Yeah, it's great to see you again.
Yeah.
I hope I'll come out to San Francisco and look you up. We could talk some more.
That'd be lovely.
Or if you come to New York, etc.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye, y'all. It was a
All
pleasure.
right,
Bob,
thanks,
thanks again. And I would
Thanks
just
again.
like to encourage people to keep an eye on marxedproject.org, Marxist Education Project's website. We have about half a dozen events coming up in October and November on topics ranging from adventure capitalism, a history of libertarian exit, Jean Jaurès and the history of the French Revolution, palm oil, the grease of empire with Max Haven, Jason Moore, Beyond Climate Justice, and Bill Robinson on global civil war, capitalism post-pandemic. And in terms of the classes that we organize, I would just say we have several that you can register for coming up in October on Toward a Revolution in Labor History, Marxist Political Writings, which David Worley, who's with us tonight, will be guiding. I and Steve Knight, who was also with us earlier, will be leading a group on climate, class, and degrowth, two new books on politics, the politics and strategies involved in confronting climate change. And Jacqueline, who was also with us tonight, is involved with a new edition of our ongoing literature group, which will be reading some of the novels of Nanni Balestrini, who was one of the leading figures in the workerist movement in Italy in the 1960s and 70s. So all of those be further information on our website, marxedproject.org. And we will look forward to seeing everyone again. And Bob, anytime you would like to lead a class on world systems theory or any other topic for the MEP, you will be welcome. So thanks again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay.